This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Today's show is about a place that looms large in many Minnesotans' memories, Camp Snoopy at the Mall of America. The indoor theme park was a favorite for locals and tourists alike from 1992, when the mall first opened, to 2006, when the Peanuts characters had to go, prompting lots of good grief headlines in newspapers. This question came to us from Sam Kennedy during the state fair. At the Minnesota Star Tribune booth, we asked fairgoers to vote on their favorite questions, and this was a top contender.
What happened to Camp Snoopy? And I asked that because I grew up around the area, and I remember going to Camp Snoopy when I was a kid, and just seeing it change. It changing over to Nickelodeon Universe just for like younger me was it was a pretty big shift, to be honest. And I was just always curious about what happened.
Thanks so much to Sam for this great question. I'm here today with my colleague Greta Kaul, who wrote about Camp Snoopy's glory days and exit from the Mall of America for Curious Minnesota. Welcome, Greta. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So what drew you to take on this question?
I grew up in Minnesota in the 90s, and on those cold weather days in the winter, especially when my parents wanted to get us out of the house, they would often take us to Camp Snoopy so that we could get our energy out.
Got it. And do you have some specific Camp Snoopy memories that pop into your head?
I thought about a lot of them while I was working on this story, but I think the one that sticks out the most is I think when I was about 4 years old or 5 years old, probably pretty small, my dad took me on the log chute ride, and I was probably a little bit too young for it. And I remember just somehow absolutely getting soaked at the bottom of the big chute. And if I remember correctly, my dad had to buy me a change of clothes at the mall because I was inconsolable because I was just like a soaking wet small child.
I'm sure lots of our listeners have similar log chute moments, so that's great. So tell me about how Camp Snoopy came to the Mall of America in the first place.
Camp Snoopy was at the mall from the get-go. So when it first opened in 1992, Camp Snoopy was a huge attraction. We found some clips from newspapers of people coming on the first day that the mall was open who were just so excited to come to Camp Snoopy. And one of them was a little girl who said that she wanted to tell her kids someday that she was one of the first people to go to Camp Snoopy.
And this was especially fitting, right? Because of Peanuts creator Charles Schulz's Minnesota roots?
Yes, as we learned in a previous Curious Minnesota about all the Snoopy statues around town, Charles Schulz was from St. Paul and grew up there. So a lot of his cartoons were sort of about the Minnesota winterscapes and things like that. So
for sure. So what were some of the park's highlights?
Well, I would say one that kept coming up was the big red dog bowl that was at one of the entrances to the park. A lot of people seem to remember that was a meeting point before the era of cell phones. And I know like a lot of kids' parents would say, like, if you get lost, meet at the giant dog bowl. So that was quite a landmark. In terms of rides, there was, of course, the traumatic log chute, which is now one of my favorite rides. It's still there. It's great. There was also the Ripsaw roller coaster. There was a giant inflatable Snoopy, which was very fun as a kid. And then there was, if you remember, the kite tree that kind of went around in circles. That was, I think, Woodstock branded at the time. So there were all kinds of Snoopy and Peanuts-related kind of branding on the rides.
Yeah, and there was a big fountain, I remember, like colorful fountain.
Yes, that one I had not seen or thought about it in so long. And then I went into our archives and was looking at photos, and I found that picture of the fountain, and I feel like it brought me right back to Camp Snoopy.
Yeah. What are some of the details that people talk about when they think about being there? You told me earlier that someone posted online about a smell of chlorine and cinnamon rolls.
Yes, that one got me laughing because I feel like I can imagine that smell in my head. And I'm sure it hasn't changed that much because I think if you went to the mall, you would find both chlorine or whatever they put in the theme park water and cinnamon rolls. I think there's just that roar of kind of kids on rides in an enclosed space too that I associate with Camp Snoopy, and that's probably still around too. And other than that, I think it's just those details. You would see the Camp Snoopy characters, people dressed up in costumes as the Camp Snoopy characters walking around. I remember they had a band that would like play on the weekends and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and when they first opened, it was novel that there were so many plants inside, and it still does kind of have this vibe of like you're indoors, but it feels almost like you're outdoors.
Yeah, totally. And when I talked to the mall staff, they said it was also built with kind of this undulating floor, so it's meant to feel like you're outside because the floor isn't totally level. It actually kind of undulates a little bit, and it has those paths on it.
Yeah, I was noticing that when I was there recently, how it does slope and climbs as you're walking around.
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/twincities.
And we're back. Okay, so things were going well for Camp Snoopy for 13 years, and then what happened?
Yeah, so after 13 years of Camp Snoopy, the mall was in negotiations to keep Camp Snoopy, but the company Cedar Fair, which is now owned by Six Flags, had the rights to put the Peanuts characters in parks, and they and the Mall of America had been in negotiations to keep Peanuts characters around, but those negotiations ultimately fell through. And so the Peanuts characters had to be removed from the parks.
Yeah, and I remember the Star Tribune ran a photo of a worker wheeling out the dog bowl that you were talking about, or was it a house?
It was a little dog house. Yeah, it was so sad just seeing like the little red dog house on wheels getting wheeled out of Camp Snoopy forever. And I actually asked the mall where some of those fixtures went, and they said it's really touchy with IP. Because companies have rights to those objects. They couldn't like keep them. I was wondering if there's like a stash of Camp Snoopy stuff somewhere. And it sounds like that's not likely. It's probably kind of went back to the people with the rights to it.
Yeah. And it was Knott's Berry Farm for a while, and then Cedar Fair, and now Six Flags. And are there still parks that have Snoopy characters?
Yeah, there still are. If you go out to California, you can find them still at Knott's Berry Farm. I think that Valley Fair actually has some Snoopy themed stuff. I haven't been there in a while, so I cannot attest to it and how much it's like Camp Snoopy. But they do have some Snoopy presence there.
Got it. And so the mall decided to take over running the park. And were there details that they shared about why they couldn't agree?
They didn't say much about that, but for 2 years they operated the park without really any branding. So it was just the park at MOA, and they sort of kept the like naturalistic feel with the plants and stuff, but they removed the Peanuts stuff, and it was like that for 2 years. I was trying to remember that period, and I think I was kind of at an age then when I wasn't going to Camp Snoopy as much, so that era I don't remember well. After a couple of years, they were negotiating and kind of trying to find a partner to bring in some branding for the park, and they ended up signing with Nickelodeon.
Yeah, so now it's Nickelodeon Universe, and you wrote that it's been Nickelodeon Universe for longer than it was ever Camp Snoopy, which is striking. Is there anything left from you mentioned the log flume, but is there any other things that are left from the Camp Snoopy days?
There's not a ton, and the things that are left are not branded, Camp Snoopy anymore. But the roller coaster, I think, is now, its affiliation is slightly different, but it's the same roller coaster, that one that used to be the Ripsaw roller coaster. And then the log chute, and there's not a ton else.
But when Nickelodeon came in, it was really celebrated at the time, and I think some folks felt like it was a good time to see Snoopy and Charlie Brown go.
Yeah, it was so interesting to me to look back on that time because, people were really saying, yeah, Snoopy, those characters have kind of had their moment, and now they're just not as celebrated as they once were, and so it's kind of time for something new. So even though the mall had tried to keep them around, people were saying it's probably time for them to go. And actually, in a Star Tribune article from that time, there was a quote. We had interviewed a marketing consultant about the changeover, and that marketing consultant said, "Peanuts and the gang just aren't relevant to the current generation of young children." They stayed the same and their marketing strategy never progressed. They were of a time and that time has passed. I think that's really funny because if anybody's been paying attention to social media lately, Snoopy especially has been really having a moment with Gen Z, which is kind of the same generation that grew up with Nickelodeon Universe. So I think that's kind of ironically funny.
Yeah. A lot of millennials, I think, too, are sort of feeling the nostalgia for Snoopy, and that's why it was fun to revisit Camp Snoopy. And we put a little call out to readers to share some of their memories. What did you end up hearing and seeing that people sent?
Yeah, so we got just kind of a few emails, just remembrances of how special the park was to people, and that was really fun. We got a few pictures of kids on some of the rides, which was really fun. If people remember there were like the plane, there was the Snoopy plane ride and stuff like that. We got some of that, and it was just really fun to see those.
Very well. Thanks so much, Greta.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.